You think the president should be impeached?
Yes, sir, I do.
The Watergate scandal. One of the most pivotal moments in U.S. history. Through abuse of power, political wrongdoings, and an invasion of public trust, this scandal would forever change the perception of the American people. But let's take it back. Back to the beginning. Back where it all started. January 9th, 1913, in Yorba Linda, California, a baby was born. A baby by the name of Richard Milhouse Nixon. Nixon's life started out pretty normal. He attended Whittier Elementary School, where he kept good grades and became the president of his 8th grade class. He grew up playing soccer, but later turned to football and track. Growing up, Nixon's family was not wealthy by any means. Later down the line, he said, "We were poor, but the glory of it was we didn't know it." Little did Nixon know that the lack of money would not be the most saddening thing to happen in his life. In 1925, when Nixon was only 12 years old, his brother Arthur contracted tubercular encephalitis. Unfortunately, this disease would lead to the death of his brother at the young age of 7. And sadly, Nixon's trauma does not stop there. Just 8 short years later, Nixon's other brother Harold died at the age of 23 due to health complications. Many people wonder if Nixon's traumatic childhood correlates to his political wrongdoings as president. Nixon's run to presidency. Throughout college, Nixon was extraordinary. He graduated second in his class at Whittier College, obtaining his Bachelor of Arts degree in 1934. But schooling for Nixon doesn't stop there, as he continued his education at Duke University, obtaining his Bachelor of Laws in 1937, just 3 years later. Following all of this schooling, Nixon decided to join the Naval Forces in 1942. 24 years later, in 1966, Nixon retired from the U.S. Navy. On leaving service, Nixon was elected into Congress from his California district. In 1950, Nixon won a Senate seat after taking down Helen Douglas. Just 2 years later, General Eisenhower selected Richard Nixon to be his running mate. When Eisenhower won, Nixon had to take on major duties, being Eisenhower's vice president.
To Eisenhower!
In 1960, Nixon was nominated for president by acclamation, where he lost by a narrow margin to John F. Kennedy. 8 years later, in 1968, he again was nominated for president by acclamation, where he went on to defeat Vice President Hubert H. Humphrey and third-party candidate George C. Wallace. So there it is, Richard Nixon became the 37th president of the United States. When Nixon was elected in 1968, he declared that his goal was to bring the American people together. So here are some of the things that Nixon was able to accomplish before it all went wrong. When Nixon was elected into presidency, he said he had a plan to disengage America from Vietnam. It took Nixon 5 years to actually go through with his plan. While in office, Nixon ended the draft, created new anti-crime laws, and created the Environmental Protection Agency. He welcomed back the astronauts who executed the first moon landing, and he flew to Beijing to meet with Mao Zedong. In 1972, Nixon was re-elected as the president after defeating U.S. Senator George McGovern in a historic-level landslide. But shortly after Nixon's re-election is when things started to go downhill. On June 17th of 1972, 5 men were arrested after breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters. In the possession of these men were burglary tools, cameras and film, and 3 pin-sized tear gas guns. After further investigation of these 5 men's rooms, they found sophisticated electronic bugging equipment. These burglars were later identified as Bernard Baker, Virgilio Gonzalez, Eugenio Martinez, Frank Sturgis, and the most important of all, James McCord. Just one day after these burglars were caught, it was revealed that James McCord was the salaried security coordinator for President Richard Nixon's re-election committee. Weird, they have connections. The day after, another connection was made to Nixon. A former White House aide named Everett Howard Hunt Jr. was linked to the 5 suspects. In July, a man named George Gordon Liddy, the finance counsel for the committee of the re-election of the president, was also implicated as an accomplice. Starting to get a bit suspicious for Nixon, right? Well, in September and October, reporters Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward of the Washington Post uncovered evidence of illegal political espionage carried out by the White House and the Committee for the Re-election of the President. Regardless of all this, Nixon was still able to win in a landslide for his re-election, as stated earlier, but things for Nixon don't end there. All Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein were looking for was some hardcore evidence that Nixon was involved in this Watergate scandal. And the evidence they were looking for started to come. A man called the Deep Throat, later identified as Mark Felt, provided Bernstein and Woodward information on Nixon's involvement in the scandal. It was realized that the burglars' intention was to gain information that could be used against Democrats in the upcoming election to help Nixon win. As the Watergate burglars and their collaborators were convicted, it became pretty clear that Nixon knew much more than he had let on. From Bernstein and Woodward's stories to the televised hearings in the US Senate about the break-in, this scandal became known to the public. People became angry, upset, and scared of the government, and they wanted Nixon impeached. Proof of Nixon's wrongdoings came when it was revealed that he recorded every conversation in the Oval Office during his presidency, and these recordings had proof that he was guilty. The audio clip I will play you is called "The Smoking Gun." It's a conversation between H.R. Haldeman and President Nixon over the scandal. In the clip I'll play you, you'll hear H.R. Haldeman say things such as, "We're back in the problem area because the FBI is not under control." In the problem area, huh? Sounds like an admission of guilt. Take a listen.
On the investigation, the Democratic break-in thing, we're back in the problem area because the FBI is not under control because Gray doesn't exactly know how to control it. And their investigation is now leading into some productive areas because they've been able to trace the money, not through the money itself, but through the bank, sources, and the banker himself.
After these audio clips had been released, it was almost evident that Nixon would be impeached. But on August 9th of 1974, Richard Nixon resigned from presidency. In Nixon's resignation speech, he never admitted to guilt. Nixon claimed that he resigned because it was better for the people, it was better for America. But the people knew this was not true. Just listen to the live reaction of these people after Nixon announced his resignation.
I think, he says he's leaving a legacy of world peace. I think he's leaving a legacy of cynicism, particularly among the young, and financial instability and insecurity.
History will write the true story of President Nixon.
These civilians are claiming that Nixon has left a bad impact on society. The man in this video also claims that whether or not Nixon claims he is good, history will show his true form. So now let's dive into the impact this scandal had on society and why it will forever be a turning point in history. The first impact this scandal had on society is the loss of trust people had in the government institutions. When the US people saw the president and top officials lying and abusing their power, it made them feel betrayed. This loss of trust changed how Americans saw their leaders and government, leaving a long-lasting impact on the country's history. In the aftermath of Watergate, there were also significant legal and political reforms aimed at preventing abuses of power. An example of this is after the scandal, most law schools in the United States required courses about professional responsibility, as well as the American Bar Association rewrote its responsibility code. Another way this scandal impacted US history is it created an era of celebrity journalists. Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward became two journalists who were bigger than the stories they covered. Speaking of Bob Woodward, let's listen to his take on why the Watergate scandal still matters today. In Bob Woodward's TED Talk uploaded on January 20th, 2017, he states that the Watergate scandal teaches us to pay attention to the people in our government and to pay attention to who they really are and what's driving them. In Carl Bernstein's interview with ABC News uploaded on June 19th of 2022, he stated that with the Vietnam War going on during his presidency, there was already declining trust, but the Watergate scandal took this decline of trust to a whole nother level. So there you have it, the Watergate scandal, one of the most impactful moments in US history. Nixon's wrongdoings in the office made the entire US population scared and have no trust for the US government. This scandal shone a light on the corruption inside of the White House and led to tons of reforms within society and positions of power. So with that, the Watergate scandal will forever be a turning point in US history.